counterweight system wasn't really working out, so I decided to scrap the approach, but I wasn't quite ready to give up driving everything from one input. I hadn't yet changed the gear ratio to match the digital design, but with only a small reduction I didn't expect it to make much of a difference, and sure enough, it didn't. Somehow it was performing worse. I was sure enough torque was being provided to move the rack driving the platforms, and an identical test rig made it look quite easy, so what was going wrong here? Gears separating and grinding against each other had been a regular occurrence, so I thought I'd have one last go at fixing the issue by making sure gears couldn't separate from each other. The first location was the housing of the worm gear driving the platforms, which wasn't fixed very securely to the framework, so I added in some extra lift arms to keep it locked in place. This actually made quite a positive difference by itself, but I still wanted to go further. The second location and the source of the current grinding was the first set of gears on the input drive shaft. I should have really done a better job of fixing these in earlier, as with their reduction in torque they are the most likely to slip. There really wasn't anything connecting that green lift arm to the parallel drive shaft, and the flexibility of the supporting legs meant that the beveled gears could easily separate. The best way to hold beveled gears together is with a frame, but that wasn't an option here. I tend to avoid axle-based connectors where possible, as forces can easily pull them off the axles, so this needed something else. Ideally, I'd want to use one solid element, like a lift arm, which couldn't pull apart, but having a connection point to one of the legs right next to the input drive shaft was preventing me from using most connectors I could run through that lift arm. It would be possible if I moved the input drive shaft over one module, but I couldn't do that because of the nearby grass platform. I got distracted here by the flimsy crank handle, which I decided to do something about, but forgot to change the scene back, so hopefully you can make out what I'm doing here. The handle was attached by only a 2-module axle plugged into a connector, which could easily be pulled out, so really I needed a longer axle with something like a bush on the other side of the lift arm, preventing the axle from being pulled through. But there might be something better. Lego make an axle with a stop ring, which would absolutely prevent it from pulling through the lift arm, and I found out it was just the right length here, with a little extra for a half bush to stop the handle pulling off the axle. Going back to the gears, I was thinking that an 11 module flip-flop lift arm was what I needed here, so I had to reconfigure the adjacent leg to support one. The arm then allowed me to configure shorter offshoots that would lock the lift arm to the drive shaft. I started with straight thin lift arms, but decided their potential to pivot could compromise gears meshing, so opted instead for L shapes. With everything installed and sections pushed back together, it was definitely the smoothest I'd had it running. Maybe not quite as quick as I wanted, but I was confident most people would be able to turn the crank. With one crank sorted, I got thinking about the crank and mechanism for Section 4's boss battle. I needed to drive a worm gear for both the left and right side ship turning chains, plus one for the rack and sinus mechanism to move the ship. Positioning the crank in the centre of the lower facade seemed to be the best place, as I could easily split the drive shaft in 2 directions. The worm gear driving the rack and sinus system needed to run at only 1/4 of the speed of the input, so I initially set up a 1:2 gear ratio for this and a 2:1 ratio for the ship rotator, but I thought using a chain for this could make it prone to slipping, so I lowered the gear housings and directly meshed the gears. Is any of this making sense? I really don't know whether I explain things well enough sometimes. I'd originally planned on driving one of these gear systems via a chain from the other, but again I was concerned about slipping, so I felt it would be better to drive each side independently, but as I was doubling the gear ratio of these, the output to the next mechanism would need reducing back down before being halved again. I'm not really a fan of these gear coupling connectors. I find that the flat gears have a habit of falling off them, so I made my first of several mistakes here, moving the gear housings out to fit a small frame around the beveled gears, completely forgetting that they needed aligning with the gears higher up. After removing most of what I'd designed, I again tried small frames to hold gears together, but axles weren't aligned with pinholes in this orientation, and there wasn't enough room for the frame to be turned the other way, unless I removed the gears that increased the input speed. Now I could have doubled the gear ratio before those beveled gears, but then the input drive shaft and crank handle would need repositioning, which I felt reluctant to do, so here I made my next mistake. Lego had introduced a new 14-tooth beveled gear, which I thought I could pair with a 28-tooth gear to give me a 1:2 ratio, not knowing that these new gears are apparently incompatible with their older cousins. Fortunately, I found that I still couldn't easily fit frames around these new gears and reverted back to the first method. I could really do with a breather here, so there was the potential to move the upper gears driving the chains, but with the restrictions to where I could place them, this wasn't any help. After struggling for a while to make any meaningful progress, I once again considered those new beveled gears, then spent nearly an hour redesigning the framework before deciding to check whether the gears were actually compatible. They were not. So once more it was back to the earlier gear system, but fortuitously I found I didn't have to make any drastic changes to what I'd designed. There was one minor issue. If I were to position beveled gears next to the 24-tooth gears, they would only be supported from one side, so I swapped them out for flat 20-tooth gears to give me just that little bit of axle I could support. Supporting it wouldn't be easy though, as any connector I used would be misaligned with the framework and require offset connectors to fix into, but I wasn't convinced these connectors would be stable enough. I tried thin triangular lift arms, but it looked as though there wasn't quite enough clearance for the teeth of the first gear, so I wound up using regular thin lift arms instead. While designing framework for the upper gears, I made another mistake that I wouldn't catch until I was physically building it. As Studio doesn't currently have the chain link with a bar, I'd forgotten the bar is 1.5 modules long and placed connectors too close to the gears. I locked the worm gear housing in place in the same way I had earlier, changing the 24-tooth for a 40-tooth as I'd swapped another gear earlier in the drivetrain. Finally, I needed to fix in the gear rack for the swing of the wrecking ball, which I did my best to really lock in place to prevent the possibility of the wrecking ball slipping. The design appeared to be finished now, though I really didn't know how well it would physically function. There's only one way to find out.